Welcome to the Wellbeing Podcast, where every episode is a step towards a healthier, happier you. Let's grow, thrive, and shine together. Don't forget to subscribe and like the Wellbeing Podcast. Share your thoughts and let us know in the comments what topics you'd love to hear about in future episodes.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into something you might not typically associate with well-being. The Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes Fire Authority's financial strategy for 2020 to 2025.
You'd be surprised how relevant this can be to your own life. We're not just talking about fire trucks and hoses, but about how an organization grapples with long-term goals, limited resources, and planning for the unexpected.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But I'll admit, when I hear financial strategy, I think spreadsheets and jargon. How do we make this relatable to everyday well-being?
It's all about applying those big picture concepts to our own lives. Think about it. The fire authority has to figure out how to use their money wisely to protect our community. Isn't that similar to how we manage our personal finances to achieve our goals and protect our own well-being? I see the connection. We're all trying to make the most of what we have and plan for a secure future. So walk me through this. What makes this financial strategy so unique or insightful?
Well, right off the bat, they acknowledge that their financial stability is heavily tied to council tax. A whopping 2/3 of their funding comes from that.
2/3. That's putting a lot of eggs in one basket, isn't it? What happens if the local economy takes a hit? Or people vote against tax increases?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of their risk management. They've clearly thought about this because they highlight alternative income streams, things like leasing space for telecom equipment, even cost recovery from collaborations with other agencies.
Wait, so they're making money off cell towers on fire stations? That's pretty resourceful, I have to admit. But does that really make a dent compared to something as massive as council tax revenue?
It's likely more about diversification than replacing council tax entirely. It shows they're not just passively relying on one source, but exploring options. It's like having a side hustle to boost your income, but for an entire organization.
I like that analogy. And it ties back to personal well-being, too. Having multiple income streams can definitely reduce financial stress. So where does all this money say? What are their biggest expenses?
No surprise here. Employee costs take the lion's share, almost 75%. That includes salaries, pensions, training, the whole package for their workforce.
Well, that makes sense. You can't have a fire service without well-trained firefighters, right? But I'm curious, they specifically highlight their finance team's performance. Why is that so important in the grand scheme of things?
They actually won an award for Finance Team of the Year. And it's not just a pat on the back. The document emphasizes that even with a small team, their efficiency and collaboration were key to winning. It suggests they view a strong finance department as essential, not just a bunch of number crunchers.
So it's like saying, to be good at protecting the community, we need to be equally good at managing our money. It's all connected.
Exactly. And they're not just focused inward. They acknowledge the external factors they can't control, like government regulations, changing demand for services, even the impact of something like COVID-19.
It's like trying to manage your personal finances when the world keeps throwing curveballs. You can make the best budget, but unexpected events can throw everything off.
And that's where their long-term goals get really interesting. One of them is to reduce overhead costs, something I'm sure we can all relate to.
Absolutely. Who doesn't want to trim the fat in their spending? But how does a fire authority even DO that? Their core function seems pretty fixed. You need fire stations, trucks, personnel. Where do they find wiggle room?
They're looking at it from multiple angles, potentially downsizing their office space, upgrading systems for better efficiency, and even exploring collaborations with other organizations to share resources.
Okay, I see how that can work. It's about being strategic and finding ways to do more with less, without compromising on essential services.
Precisely. And this ties into another key goal, retaining their experienced staff. They're not just focused on cutting costs. They're investing in the people who make the organization run smoothly.
Makes sense. Training new people is expensive, and you lose valuable institutional knowledge. But how does a financial strategy address that? It's not just about throwing money at the problem, right?
It's about creating a work environment that values expertise. They talk about succession planning, professional development opportunities, and fostering a supportive culture. It's like saying, we want our skilled people to stay and thrive here.
That's smart. It costs less to retain good people than to constantly replace them. It's a bit like investing in your own well-being through learning and growth, so you can handle whatever challenges come your way.
That's a great parallel, and this leads us to what I think is the most fascinating part of their strategy, scenario planning.
Scenario planning, that sounds intense. Is this where they predict the future?
Not exactly predicting, but more like preparing for different possibilities. They've modeled out several scenarios, ranging from optimistic to reasonable worst case. Think of it as their way of saying, okay, if this happens, we do that. But if that happens, we need a plan B.
So they're not just hoping for the best, but actively considering what could go wrong. It's like having a financial emergency fund, but for an entire organization.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be a bit overwhelming, planning for every possible scenario?
It could be, but they've narrowed it down to 4 key scenarios, each representing a different set of financial circumstances. They start with an optimistic outlook, then move through increasingly challenging scenarios, culminating in that reasonable worst-case situation.
I'm definitely curious to hear about these scenarios and what strategies they've come up with. But before we get into that, there's one thing I'm still a bit fuzzy on: the concept of reserves. They keep mentioning it, but I need a bit more clarity on what it means and why it's so important.
Ah, yes. The financial safety net. Reserves are essentially funds set aside for specific purposes or for general emergencies. Think of it like having separate savings accounts. One for your vacation, one for unexpected car repairs, and maybe even a just-in-case fund.
Okay, that makes sense. So they're not just spending every dollar that comes in, they're putting some aside for a rainy day. But I imagine even for a fire authority,
Yeah.
those reserves aren't unlimited, right?
Exactly. And that's why their scenario planning becomes even more important. The reserves are there to provide a buffer, to buy them time to adjust. But those difficult choices still have to be made if things go south.
It's a sobering thought, but a necessary one. I'm eager to hear about those specific scenarios and how their reserves factor into their strategies.
Yeah.
I have a feeling there are some valuable lessons here that we can all apply to our own lives, even if we're not managing a fire authority's budget. Shall we delve into those scenarios now?
Absolutely. Let's dive into those what-if situations and see how they plan to navigate those financial waters. You might be surprised by how relatable some of their challenges and solutions are. Welcome back to the Wellbeing Podcast.
Where we're continuing our exploration of the Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes Fire Authority's financial strategy. And, believe it or not, finding some surprisingly relevant lessons for our own lives.
It's all about that proactive mindset, and they really showcase that with their scenario planning. They've laid out 4 potential situations, each with different financial implications. It's like they're saying, let's not just react to whatever happens, let's be prepared.
That's a great way to frame it. So take me through these scenarios. What's the best case situation they've envisioned?
They call it their optimistic scenario, and it hinges on an increase in the council tax referendum limit. Imagine them suddenly having an extra £500,000 annually.
Okay, that's a significant boost. I'd be tempted to throw a big party.
Yeah.
But knowing them, they probably have a more strategic plan for that windfall.
You're right on the money. Their top priority. Bolstering their frontline staff. They talk about making temporary fire protection staff permanent, increasing overall firefighter numbers, and continuing efforts to recruit more on-call firefighters.
So even with extra cash, they're not losing sight of their core mission.
Hmm.
Protecting the community. That's like saying, more money doesn't mean we shift priorities. It means we can do our primary job even better.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is they also mention using some of that extra funding to implement solutions outlined in their no-change scenario. It's a bit like using a surplus to invest in long-term improvements, even when things are going well.
That's smart. Not just spending it all on immediate needs, but using it to build a stronger foundation for the future. It's like using a bonus to pay down debt or invest in your education.
Yeah.
Setting yourself up for long-term success.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the sunny side of things. What does the no-change scenario look like? Business as usual?
Not quite. Even with a stable financial outlook, they're looking for ways to optimize their resources. They talk about reducing their office footprint and embracing flexible working arrangements for office staff.
Ah, the classic downsizing the office move.
Yeah.
With so many people working remotely these days, that makes sense. Fewer desks,
Yeah.
lower rent,
Mm.
smaller utility bills. Those savings can add up quickly. But does that affect their ability to respond to emergencies?
They seem confident it won't. They're not talking about closing fire stations, just making their administrative operations more efficient. They also mention reprofiling their property maintenance and vehicle replacement programs.
Reprofiling. That sounds like a fancy way of saying delaying. Is that a risky move? Could it lead to bigger problems down the line?
It's a balancing act, for sure. They're probably weighing the short-term savings against the potential long-term costs of neglecting maintenance or running outdated vehicles. It's a bit like deciding whether to fix that leaky faucet now or risk a burst pipe later.
Okay, I see the dilemma. Sometimes you have to prioritize immediate needs over long-term wants. But you don't want to create bigger problems for yourself down the road. What other strategies are they considering in this no-change scenario?
They mention exploring outsourcing or sharing some support functions with other organizations. This could mean things like ITHR or even legal services.
Pooling resources. That makes sense. It's like joining a buying club to get bulk discounts, strength in numbers and all that. But I imagine it also requires a lot of trust and coordination between organizations.
You're right, collaboration isn't always easy, but they seem to be leaning into it, suggesting it's crucial for weathering those tighter financial periods. And if things get really tough, they're not afraid to dip into those reserves we talked about.
Ah, the emergency fund comes to the rescue. It's reassuring to know they have that safety net, but I imagine they'd rather not deplete it if they can avoid it. Okay, brace yourself, because I think we're about to enter the realm of those less than ideal scenarios. Let's talk about the pessimistic one. What does that entail?
This scenario paints a tougher picture. Reductions in both council tax and settlement funding assessment, resulting in a projected shortfall of £1.7 million.
Ouch. That's a significant chunk of their budget. I'm guessing the party is officially canceled at this point. What kind of measures are they considering to address this shortfall?
They'd have to make some difficult trade-offs, starting with reducing bank shift availability for firefighters. This means fewer firefighters available at certain times and locations, potentially impacting response times.
Okay, so we're starting to see the impact on frontline services. Are there any other areas they're looking to cut back on?
They also mention removing the second pump from one or more of their whole-time fire stations, essentially. That means reducing the number of fire engines available to respond to incidents.
Wow. These are some tough choices.
Yeah.
It's like having to decide which bills to pay when money is tight. You prioritize the essentials, but might have to make sacrifices in other areas.
It highlights the cascading impact of financial constraints. Those budget cuts can ultimately affect the services provided to the community. And it's not just about equipment and resources. These decisions can affect morale and stress levels within the organization.
Absolutely. It's like when you're feeling financially squeezed. It affects every aspect of your life. It's stressful, and it can strain relationships. I imagine it's similar for an organization like this. The pressure is on everyone to do more with less.
Okay. I'm steeling myself for the reasonable worst-case scenario. What does their crystal ball show in this situation?
This is where things get really dire. Imagine the same funding reductions as the pessimistic scenario, but with an added layer of pain, the loss of specific grant funding for pensions and the Urban Search and Rescue USR team.
Wait, their specialized rescue team, that's a critical capability, not just for their local area, but for national emergencies. Surely they wouldn't lose that entirely.
It's not something they want to do, but they've acknowledged it as a possibility in this extreme scenario. They're facing a projected shortfall of £4 million, a massive hole to fill.
So all the measures from the pessimistic scenario are on the table, but they're still short millions. What other options are they even considering at this point?
They'd likely have to consider closing one or more fire stations altogether. Wow, that's a last resort move. I can't imagine the impact that would have on the community. Longer response times, reduced coverage, increased risk.
It would be a devastating decision. But in this extreme scenario, they're facing the harsh reality of limited resources and having to prioritize. It's a sobering reminder that even essential services are vulnerable when funding dries up.
It's like having to choose between paying your rent or buying groceries. Impossible choices that no one should have to make. But these are the kinds of decisions they're forced to consider in this reasonable worst-case scenario. It's a stark reminder of the importance of sound financial planning and the need to be prepared for unexpected challenges.
Absolutely. Their approach to scenario planning, even when considering these extreme situations, is a valuable lesson for all of us. It's about taking control, being proactive, and having a plan, which ultimately contributes to a greater sense of well-being, even in the face of uncertainty.
So they've laid out these scenarios, ranging from optimistic to downright scary. But how do they translate these hypothetical situations into concrete actions? What are the tools they use to put this financial strategy into motion?
That's where the rubber meets the road. They have a few key approaches for turning these scenarios and strategic goals into tangible results. And surprisingly, some of these tools are just as relevant for managing our personal finances as they are for running a fire authority.
Okay, I'm all ears. Walk me through how they go from big picture plans to actual implementation. Welcome back to the Wellbeing Podcast,
where we've been dissecting the Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes Fire Authority's financial strategy, uncovering some valuable insights along the way.
We've seen how they approach funding, manage expenses, and even plan for a range of potential scenarios, from the optimistic to the downright daunting.
And we've discovered that many of their strategies, even those dealing with complex organizational challenges, have parallels in our personal lives, particularly when it comes to managing resources and navigating uncertainty.
It's been eye-opening to see how those big-picture concepts translate to our everyday financial decisions. But I'm curious about one thing we touched on earlier, the idea of turning these plans into action. What tools do they use to make it all happen?
One of their primary tools is their medium-term financial plan, or MTFP.
Okay. So it's like taking that long-term vision and breaking it down into more manageable chunks,
Right.
a roadmap for the next few years. But how does it actually work? Is it just a bunch of spreadsheets and budget projections?
It's more than just numbers. It's about aligning their financial resources with their service delivery plans, risk management strategies, and asset management goals. It's about ensuring that everything works together seamlessly.
So it's a holistic approach, connecting the dots between different departments and ensuring that everyone is rowing in the same direction. Financially speaking, it's like creating a personal budget that takes into account not just your income and expenses, but also your long-term goals and potential financial risks.
That's a great way to put it. It's about having that big picture perspective and making sure that your financial decisions are supporting your overall objectives. And speaking of financial decisions, they emphasize the role of the budget as an instrument of financial control.
But I'm intrigued. Usually when I hear the word budget, I think restriction and limitations. How do they view it as a tool for control?
It's about having a clear plan for how they're going to allocate resources across the organization, coordinate the use of those resources, and monitor spending throughout the year.
So it's not just about staying within a certain limit, but about making sure that every dollar is being used effectively and strategically. It's like having a spending plan that helps you reach your financial goals and avoid overspending.
Exactly. It's about being intentional with your spending, both on an organizational level and a personal level. And they have some interesting approaches to budgeting. They even mention something called zero-based budgeting.
Zero-based budgeting, that sounds intense. Is that like starting from scratch every year and justifying every single expense?
You got it. It's a more rigorous approach compared to traditional budgeting, where you often just take the previous year's budget and make incremental adjustments. Zero-based budgeting forces them to carefully consider every expense and ensure that it aligns with their strategic priorities.
That sounds incredibly thorough,
Yeah.
but also incredibly time-consuming. Do they really do this every year?
Not necessarily. It's more of a periodic reset, a way to shake things up and make sure they're not just blindly following the same spending patterns year after year. It's like decluttering your finances and making sure that everything you're spending money on is truly adding value to your life.
I love that analogy. It's about being mindful and intentional with your spending, whether it's for an organization or your personal life. But it's not just about systems and processes, right? They also highlight the importance of strong financial leadership.
Absolutely. They dedicate an entire section to the role of the Chief Financial Officer,
Right.
or CFO.
Makes sense. You need someone at the helm who can steer the ship, financially speaking. But what qualities make a strong financial leader, in their view? Is it just about being good with numbers?
It's much more than that. They emphasize the CFO's role in developing and implementing the financial strategy, promoting a culture of financial awareness throughout the organization, and ensuring that public money is being used responsibly and effectively.
So it's about having that strategic mindset, that ability to see the big picture and connect the dots between financial decisions and the organization's overall goals. It's about being a leader, not just a number cruncher.
Precisely. And it's not just about the CFO. They also stress the importance of financial literacy and engagement at all levels of the organization, from the governing body to the senior management team to individual departments.
So it's a shared responsibility,
Yeah.
a collective effort to ensure the financial well-being of the organization. Everyone has a role to play. It's like in a family, where everyone needs to be on board with the budget and understand the impact of their financial choices.
That's a great analogy. It's about fostering a culture where everyone understands the importance of sound financial management and actively contributes to making smart decisions.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I think our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of how a financial strategy works, even in the context of a fire authority, and how those principles can be applied to our own lives.
It's been a pleasure exploring this document with you. It's a testament to how even seemingly dry topics like financial planning can offer valuable lessons and inspiration for improving our overall well-being.
It's all about being proactive, adaptable, and informed. which ultimately empowers us to create a more secure and well-balanced future, both for ourselves and our communities.
Thanks for listening to the Wellbeing Podcast.
Take care, stay inspired, and see you next time.